The old continent is steeped in history. Every building, every street, and every landscape has witnessed empires rise and fall, tragedies and legends that shaped history and the world as it is today. However, some of its darkest chapters have been erased from the map, hidden under new constructions or reduced to mere memories in the collective consciousness. Today, we're going to explore some of those places you can no longer visit, sites that have completely disappeared, perhaps never even existed, or that simply remain beyond the reach of the average person. We will also tell you what was once hidden within them. So, make yourselves comfortable and turn off the lights because these are 7 terrifying places in Europe that you cannot visit. How are you? Good morning, afternoon, or evening. And here we begin. Kimlinch Station, Sweden. Beneath the streets of Stockholm in the city's underground lies a place that for decades has fueled the fear and fascination of thousands of people. It's not a simple urban legend born from popular rumor. It's a myth that blends real events with chilling tales. A story whose main setting is a subway station that was never finished or inaugurated. A silent and forgotten place known as Kimlinch. The story begins in the mid-1960s when Stockholm's subway system sought to modernize and expand its services. In this context, an experimental train known as the SLS-5 emerged, an aluminum prototype that was never painted the characteristic green color of the rest of the fleet. Its metallic and cold appearance immediately stood out among the other carriages, and this, coupled with its empty interior and sparse decoration, created an extremely sterile and desolate atmosphere. Even the sound it produced as it moved through the tunnels was different, sharper, and more resonant, increasing the discomfort of those who boarded it. And as if that weren't enough, its use was infrequent. It only appeared as a reinforcement during peak hours or in specific situations, meaning many passengers never saw it in operation. Perhaps all these details combined to create the perfect ground for reality to begin transforming into myth. Soon, rumors began to circulate about a silver train that appeared late at night when the subway was no longer in service. Some workers claimed to have seen it speeding along the deserted tracks, without stopping at any station, while others said they had heard its characteristic metallic sound in completely empty tunnels, or even voices that seemed to come from non-existent carriages. Thus, the Silver Pillen, or the Silver Arrow, went from being a real train to becoming the protagonist of one of Sweden's most chilling legends. According to the myth, the Silver Pillen appears around 3 a.m., the so-called hour of death, and those who encounter it assure that the people on board have a terrifying characteristic. Their faces are expressionless, and their eyes seem empty, as if they don't belong to the world of the living. Legend has it that anyone who boards that train is doomed, as the doors will close with no possibility of opening, and the carriage will continue its journey without stopping at known stations. In some versions, the train takes its passengers on an endless loop, where time ceases to exist. In others, it is said to transport them directly to the afterlife. There are even accounts claiming there is a way to know your fate if you board the Silver Pillen. If the train appears full of passengers, it means you will survive. But if it arrives empty, it's because it has come for you, and there is no escape. If by this point you are wondering what the legend of the train has to do with Kimlinch Station, it is precisely here that both stories intertwine. Kimlinch was part of an ambitious project that aimed to connect a future working-class neighborhood with the city's central area. However, the station was abandoned before being completed for primarily urban planning reasons. According to most versions, this was due to the fact that other areas of Stockholm were growing more rapidly, which reduced the priority of the plan. Thus, Kimlinch remained half-finished with bare concrete structures and silent platforms that never received a single passenger. It was never demolished, but it was also never inaugurated. And that suspended existence in time was enough for popular imagination to turn it into a cursed place. In Stockholm, there even arose a saying that many still repeat today: only the dead get off at Kimlinch. Legend has it that the Silver Pillen's final destination is this station, leaving behind the souls it collects during its journey. There are several stories about this, though one of the most popular is that of a young woman who, after a night of partying, decided to take the subway home. As she boarded the metallic carriage, she immediately noticed something was wrong. The few passengers on board were completely silent, and all had the same emotionless expression. Minutes later, the young woman realized the train hadn't stopped and was about to pass her station. So, she decided to activate the emergency brakes, but nothing happened. Finally, the train stopped, and the doors opened onto an unknown platform, marked with a name she had never heard: Kimlinch. The young woman noticed that all the passengers were moving for the first time throughout the journey, walking slowly out of the carriage. She followed them through the corridor and the stairs but stopped dead upon seeing something that sent a strong chill down her spine. All those people were walking directly towards a closed door, which they passed through effortlessly, as if they were ghosts. From this point, there are two versions of the story. One tells that the girl was so frightened that she fainted and was found days later, disoriented and with no memory, wandering in a nearby forest. In a darker version, her lifeless body was found in the same place, although the silver pillion was officially retired in the 1990s, and some of its carriages were used for police training. The myth never disappeared. The phantom train continues to appear in contemporary stories, television shows, books, forums, and even video games. Some claim to have seen it pass by the tracks at dawn, and others swear that if you look closely while traveling on the Blue Line, you can distinguish Kimlinch Station from the window, an empty space in the darkness. Today, the station is still there, silent and frozen in time. Officially, it is not abandoned, just indefinitely delayed, but its doors remain closed, and its platforms empty, making the place inaccessible to citizens. Perhaps this train is nothing more than a product of collective imagination, a myth born from the fear of the unknown. Or perhaps, as many in Stockholm believe, that phantom train still roams the tunnels in search of new passengers heading to a destination from which no one has ever returned. Because in the end, only the dead get off at Kimlinch, the city of Königsberg. There is something profoundly unsettling about the idea that a city can simply disappear. We're not talking about abandoned villages or forgotten hamlets, but about cities that were once the heart of an entire culture, the stage for empires and revolutions, but which today, for tragic reasons, exist only as a memory in the collective consciousness. One of these cities was Königsberg. For centuries, this city was the intellectual, political, and spiritual heart of East Prussia. It was the birthplace of philosophers, mathematicians, and writers, the capital of a duchy and then of a province, and a symbol of Prussian power. But war and human fury condemned it to disappearance, leaving behind only ruins, a name crossed off maps, and a persistent echo in the memory of those who knew it. Founded in 1255 by the Teutonic Order on the remains of a Baltic settlement, Königsberg, the King's Mountain, grew to become an important port on the Baltic Sea and one of Northern Europe's great cultural centers. Figures like Immanuel Kant, whose philosophical work forever changed the history of thought, and mathematician David Hilbert, one of the most influential of the 20th century, were born or lived here. The first works in Lithuanian and Polish were printed in its streets. Revolutionary ideas were debated, and fundamental scientific advances were developed. It was also a symbol of Prussian identity, so much so that even after German unification, the city maintained an aura of independence and prestige within the empire. However, the history of this place was also marked by its geographical position. Nestled in the easternmost part of Prussia, its location made it a strategic point, but also a vulnerable target. After World War I, it became isolated from the rest of Germany by the Polish corridor of Danzig, a separation that foreshadowed the tragic fate that awaited it just a few decades later. During the rise of the Third Reich, Königsberg was considered a spiritual bastion of German nationalism. It was in many ways a symbol of the glorious past that Nazism sought to reclaim, and therefore it also became a high-value military target. This destiny was sealed during the final years of World War II. In August 1944, the British Royal Air Force launched two devastating bombings on the city. For 4 nights, incendiary bombs reduced the historic center to ashes, destroying its medieval quarters, its university, its cathedral, and the famous castle of the Teutonic Order, which had been the residence of kings and the site of coronations. More than 5,000 people died, and 200,000 were left homeless. The flames consumed centuries of history and turned Königsberg into. However, the worst was yet to come. In January 1945, the Red Army launched a massive offensive on East Prussia. Their advance was slow and bloody. The Nazis had turned Königsberg into a fortress with 7 defensive lines, anti-tank ditches, barricades, bunkers, mines, and fortified concrete positions capable of withstanding the heaviest artillery. Even so, the Soviet offensive advanced with relentless determination. Millions of shells fell on the German defenses in a matter of hours, while aerial bombardments devastated cities and ground troops pushed from all fronts. The streets soon became battlefields with hand-to-hand combat, constant crossfire, and thousands of deaths on both sides. But for the Nazis, Königsberg was not just a military position but a spiritual symbol, and Hitler perceived its fall as a devastating blow. But even that fanaticism was not enough to stop the Soviet advance. After days of intense fighting, resistance began to collapse. On the 9th of April, 1945, General Otto Lasch, commander of the garrison, decided to surrender the city to avoid an even greater massacre. This decision came at a high cost, as Hitler condemned him to death for treason, though the sentence was never carried out. In the end, more than 90,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner, and about 42,000 died during the battle. Königsberg, the proud capital of East Prussia, had fallen. What followed was even more brutal, if that's possible, as the civilian population, already decimated by hunger and bombings, became victims of the Red Army's wrath, which ravaged the city in search of revenge for the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. 100,000 people died from violence, hunger, or disease, and the tens of thousands who survived were deported. In their place came Russian settlers and citizens from other Soviet republics, forever transforming the demographic composition of the area. The city was annexed by the Soviet Union after the Potsdam Conference, and in 1946 was renamed Kaliningrad in honor of Mikhail Kalinin, a close collaborator of Stalin. Königsberg ceased to exist. Its medieval streets were razed, its castle demolished and replaced by Soviet constructions, and its name erased from the maps. For decades, the enclave remained closed to foreigners and to most Soviets themselves, becoming an isolated military bastion. What was once a cultural jewel was transformed into a gray and unknown place, a strange and lonely point between Poland and Lithuania. Today, if you walk through the streets of Kaliningrad, you can still find traces of the city that was. The ruins of the castle, underground tunnels covered in earth, abandoned fortresses, and neighborhoods with centuries-old houses tell fragments of a history that no longer fully exists. Even the tomb of Immanuel Kant, desecrated after the Soviet invasion and now a cenotaph, remains a reminder of what was and what was lost. The tram tracks follow the same route as in Prussian times, as if the city resisted disappearing completely. But the truth is, it did disappear. Königsberg was not razed by a natural disaster nor slowly erased by the passage of time. It was destroyed on purpose, burned, occupied, and replaced by the human will to impose a new narrative. In its place now stands another city, with another language, another memory, and another name. Nothing remains standing, nothing, except the ground that once supported it. Chateau Miranda, Belgium. After immersing ourselves in the horror left by war, we step away from wartime devastation for a moment to delve into a different terrain, one where mystery and the paranormal intertwine with the passage of time. Because in the old continent, these kinds of stories are not only abundant but also incredibly terrifying. We are talking about Chateau Miranda, meaning Miranda Castle, a neo-Gothic gem built amidst the wooded hills of the Belgian Ardennes. Its imposing pointed towers seem to brush the sky, its meticulously maintained gardens, and its monumental clock accompanied immense halls that for over 150 years made this construction as majestic as it was unsettling. Although many compared it to a castle from a fairy tale, its beauty hid a deeply tragic story, marked by abandonment, suffering, and a final destiny as disturbing as the aura that always surrounded it. The origins of the castle date back to 1866, when the Liedekerke-Beaufort family, an influential aristocratic family, decided to build a new summer residence after abandoning their old home during the French Revolution. The designer was Edward Milner, an English architect famous for his neo-Gothic style and his love for Victorian landscaping, whose vision was to create a residence worthy of European nobility, a place that combined elegance and fantasy, surrounded by perfect gardens and with over 500 windows through which light could enter and touch every corner. However, Milner did not live to see his work completed, as he died suddenly before its conclusion, and to this day his death remains shrouded in mystery. But perhaps we should save his story for another video. The project was completed by the French architect Pelchner, who crowned the building with a 5-6-meter high clock tower in 1907. For decades, the castle was the scene of parties, hunts, and family gatherings, until World War II changed its destiny forever. The Nazis occupied the site, using it as a military headquarters, and the fighting of the Battle of the Bulge reached its grounds. After the war, the castle was confiscated by the National Society of Belgian Railways, which in 1950 turned it into an orphanage and holiday camp for the sick children of its workers. It was then that it received the name Chateau Noisy, referring to the constant hustle and bustle of the children who inhabited it. But not all was joy. Decades later, some of the children who spent part of their childhood there recounted unsettling stories of mistreatment, abandonment, and abuse. Although the caretakers often sent postcards with photos of the castle to families as proof of well-being, the reality was very different. Within those walls, childhood suffering left a mark that, according to many later visitors, never completely disappeared. For some years after the orphanage closed in 1980, the building continued to have minor uses, but the passage of time and extremely high maintenance costs slowly condemned it. By 1991, it was completely abandoned, and from then on, its slow and painful decline began. In 1995, an apparently arsoned fire destroyed one of its main wings, and in 2006, a storm worsened the deterioration. Nature began to reclaim its home. Fungi sprouted from the walls, ivy climbed the towers, and the steps wore down under the feet of those who still ventured inside, mainly urban explorers, but also looters who tore out floors, chimneys, and decorative pieces. Even so, the castle seemed to refuse to die completely. The huge clock on its tower continued to function for years, even though no one knew when it had last been repaired. Over time, the site became a magnet for paranormal seekers and even practitioners of occult rituals. It was not uncommon for people to claim to hear the screams of former orphans echoing in the empty corridors. Others spoke of dolls found in impossible places and childlike figures that vanished upon turning away. Thus, Chateau Miranda went from being a symbol of nobility to a nightmare scenario. The municipality of Celles even offered to restore it. But the owner family refused and in 2013 requested permission to demolish it, beginning work in 2016. First, the Gothic spires of its towers disappeared, then its walls, and finally, in October 2017, what remained of the castle was reduced to rubble. Today, on the site where that architectural gem once stood, there is nothing left but an empty lot with a panoramic view and the imagination of those who try to mentally reconstruct what once was. Locals still remember the childlike whispers heard in the ruins, as well as the sound of that clock that refused to die. Chateau Miranda, the castle that was a palace, a refuge, a prison, and a ruin, remains alive, because some places, even when they disappear, never truly leave. By the way, if you enjoy this type of content, we remind you that you can now listen to Catastrophico, our new exclusive podcast on Podimo. There we talk about the most impactful tragedies in history like never before, and we do it without censorship. We release a new episode every Monday, and you can easily join from the link in the description, the pinned comment, and all our social media. The Hinterkaifeck Farm. There are stories that, no matter how much time passes, never lose their ability to send shivers down our spines. This is one of them. And although it happened over 100 years ago, it remains one of the most disturbing, violent, and perplexing cases in German criminal history. One that will likely never be solved. We're talking about the Hinterkaifeck murders, an isolated farm in Bavarian Germany that in the spring of 1922 became the scene of unprecedented horror. The farm, located between the towns of Ingolstadt and Schrobenhausen, was inhabited by the Gruber family, consisting of Andreas and Casilia, an elderly couple, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, her children Casilia, 7, and Joseph, only 2, and the maid Maria Baumgartner, who had just started working there. The family lived in relative isolation, surrounded by forests, and their relationship with the rest of the village was strange and distant. Andreas was described as an authoritarian and violent man, known for mistreating his wife and for his unhealthy control over his daughter, with whom, according to some court records, he maintained an incestuous relationship that even led to his conviction twice. This ultimately led to young Joseph, born in 1920, being pointed out by many as the fruit of this forbidden relationship. Some months before the crime, some strange occurrences began to happen that today seem to foreshadow the great tragedy. As the person working in the house resigned abruptly after claiming to hear footsteps and voices in the attic, convinced the place was haunted, she left the farm terrified. Sometime later, Andreas found a newspaper that no one had ordered. He heard inexplicable noises at night and discovered footprints in the snow leading to the house, but found no tracks returning to the forest. A set of keys also disappeared, and scratches appeared on a horseshoe, as if someone had tried to force it. But despite all this, the father did not notify the authorities. And so we arrive at the 31st of March 1922, when just a few hours after the arrival of the new maid, the massacre occurred. That night, Andreas, his wife, Victoria, and little Kazilia had been lured to the barn one by one. There, they were attacked with a mattock, a heavy agricultural tool, and eliminated with extreme violence. Subsequently, the perpetrator entered the house and killed Maria in her room, as well as little Joseph, who was sleeping in his crib. The brutality was such that the 7-year-old girl survived for several hours, and in her desperation even pulled out strands of her hair. The bodies found in the barn were carefully stacked and covered with hay, while those inside had been covered with sheets and clothes. What happened next is perhaps even more disturbing than the murders themselves, as for several days after the crime, smoke continued to rise from the chimney. The livestock was fed, food disappeared from the pantry, and several people heard noises inside the house. The animals were well cared for, and the family dog remained tied up. Everything indicated that the killer had not only committed the massacre but had also remained living there among the bodies for at least 3 days. The farm remained silent until April 4th, when neighbors, alarmed by the family's absence and the accumulated mail, decided to approach to investigate. Upon entering the barn, they encountered the macabre discovery. The rest of the bodies were found inside the house, and the Munich police arrived shortly after and began a chaotic investigation that soon encountered several problems. To begin with, the crime scene had already been contaminated by the neighbors. Furthermore, the information was contradictory. And finally, no conclusive evidence was found. But perhaps the most disconcerting thing is that this case was full of seemingly inexplicable elements from the start. For example, the footprints that led to the house and did not return to the forest were there. The fact that no one had heard the screams despite the murders occurring at different times, the strange disappearance of the keys, the presence of the unknown newspaper, and above all, the fact that the killer seemed to know the place and the routines of all the family members perfectly. Theories soon began to emerge. One of the main suspects was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor with a close connection to the family. He had had a relationship with Victoria, and it was said he could be Joseph's real father. After discovering the bodies, he entered the house alone using a key whose origin was never clarified, and his behavior during and after the discovery was, according to witnesses, strange at best. Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, who supposedly died in World War I but whose body had never been recovered, was also mentioned. Some speculated that he had faked his death to escape, and that when he returned and discovered the incest and Victoria's new relationship, he sought revenge. Other suspects included itinerant individuals, resentful neighbors, and even the Gump brothers, identified by their own sister in a deathbed confession. The Schreier brothers and the Pichler brothers, former farm workers, and even the Taller brothers, who had been seen lurking on the property months before the tragedy, were also investigated. However, none of these lines of inquiry led anywhere. More than 100 people were interrogated over the years, but sufficient evidence was never gathered to bring a formal accusation against anyone. The case also became enigmatic with the passage of time, as shortly after the crime, in 1923, the farm was demolished by the local residents themselves, who said they could not bear the idea of living with a place marked by such a horrible tragedy, and the only thing left standing was a modest monument as a silent reminder of what had happened. Years later, during World War II, the trail of the victims' skulls, which had been sent to Munich for forensic analysis, was lost, and they never returned, adding another layer of uncertainty to an already highly mysterious case. The passage of decades also brought no answers. The police attempted to reopen the investigation in 1996, and again in 2007. And in fact, in '99, a group of police academy students tried to apply modern techniques to this case, but none of these efforts managed to shed new light on what happened. Today, more than a century later, the Hinterkaifeck crime remains unsolved. There were no confessions, no arrests, no evidence found, and no theory managed to prevail over the others. All that remains of this story are fragments of a puzzle that will probably never be completed. Because, for example, we have the footprints with no return, the noises in the attic, the missing keys, and the sadistic killer who lived among the bodies of his victims for several days. Kapustin Yar Military Base, Russia. We return to the realm of the paranormal, and there's no better way to do it than by going back to Russian territory, because there, in the south of this country, amidst the arid landscape of Astrakhan, lies a place that for over 7 decades has been surrounded by rumors, theories, and impenetrable secrets. Its name is Kapustin Yar. For many, this enigmatic military complex is the Soviet equivalent of the American Area 51, a site where tests with extraterrestrial technology would have been carried out, where unknown ships were shot down, and where non-human beings would have been studied in underground facilities. Although much of what is said cannot be proven, the combination of secrecy, historical coincidences, and documented facts has made it one of the most persistent epicenters of modern ufology. It was founded in July 1947, just weeks after the famous Roswell incident in New Mexico, something many consider more than a mere coincidence. Originally conceived as a testing ground for Soviet missiles and military technology, its creation was driven by Joseph Stalin, who ordered captured German scientists to be brought there after World War II, along with advanced documentation on rockets developed by the Third Reich. From its inception, the base was a highly secret enclave. It did not appear on maps, access was prohibited without government authorization, and it was the starting point for the development of the R-1, the first Soviet copy of the German V-2 ballistic missile. The R-5, the country's first nuclear missile, was also tested there, and nuclear tests were conducted between 1957 and 1961. But beyond its military function, the aura of mystery surrounding Kapustin Yar began to develop from its early years. According to some versions of the story, Stalin was deeply interested in the UFO phenomenon and had instructed Sergei Korolev, considered the father of the Soviet space program, to investigate both the Roswell case and sightings reported on Soviet soil. It has even been suggested that the base's geometric design was deliberately conceived to attract objects from space. The truth is that the chosen area was not coincidental. The region was known for frequent sightings of lights and unknown objects in the sky, making it, in the eyes of the Soviet government, the perfect place for both arms development and the study of unidentified phenomena. From then on, 2 more controversial accounts associated with Kapustin Yar began to circulate. One of the most cited occurred in 1948, when a Soviet pilot allegedly intercepted and shot down a silver cigar-shaped object flying over the area. The wreckage, according to legend, was quickly recovered and taken to underground facilities known as Sitkur, where it would have been analyzed by regime scientists. The story doesn't end there, as in 1950 a MiG-19 fighter was sent to intercept an unknown object moving at high speed. The encounter ended with both aircraft crashing to the ground after an exchange of fire. The plane fired a missile, while the object allegedly responded with a beam of energy. The wreckage of the craft was taken to Kapustin Yar, and according to documents attributed to the KGB, a second craft was shot down in 1960, this time with 2 beings inside whose bodies were allegedly transported to Moscow for study. Over the following decades, reports of strange incidents only multiplied. In 1968, an alleged attack on a base by unidentified objects was reported, which would have destroyed several missile silos. In 1975, an explosion with no official explanation damaged structures at the complex, and witnesses claimed to have seen a ship emitting a luminous beam over the area moments before. And in July 1989, Soviet military personnel reported the presence of several disc-shaped objects and luminous domes over a nearby weapons depot. An interceptor aircraft was dispatched, but the objects maneuvered in such a way as to prevent any approach. This incident was mentioned in the so-called Blue File, a KGB dossier on unidentified aerial phenomena revealed after the fall of the Soviet Union. For all these reasons, the comparison with Roswell was inevitable. Like the American case, rumors speak of recovered ships, secret autopsies, and clandestine projects aimed at studying technology from another world. There are also parallels in how both governments handled information with absolute secrecy and an official policy of denial. However, there are notable differences. While Area 51 has been the subject of international attention and numerous leaks, Kapustin Yar has remained much more in the shadows, protected by Soviet and then Russian secrecy, which has further fueled theories about what really happened there. However, not everyone accepts these stories as facts. Skeptical researchers maintain that many of the UFO claims at Kapustin Yar originated from baseless rumors or misinterpretations of natural phenomena and secret military tests. Sergei Khrushchev, son of Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, and a participant in the missile program, stated that there was never any real evidence of extraterrestrial visits, and that the objects detected in the sky turned out, in most cases, to be balloons or American spy planes. Even Russian ufologist Mikhail Gertstein dismissed the famous story of the saucer shot down in 1948 as false, although he acknowledged that in the 1980s, a minor project called Circle was established, dedicated to monitoring unidentified aerial phenomena. Despite everything, the fascination with the place, also known as the Russian Roswell, has not diminished. Its mix of proven facts, such as the development of nuclear weapons and missile tests, with unverifiable accounts, such as the recovery of ships and autopsies of non-human beings, has made it a favorite scenario for those who believe that governments around the world possess evidence of extraterrestrial life and are hiding it. And although many of these stories will probably remain mere rumors, the veil of mystery surrounding this place continues intact. Today, Kapustin Yar remains active and was the scene in April 2024 of the launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile. But its history goes far beyond that of a simple testing ground. It is the story of a place that, between documented reality and the most extraordinary speculation, represents one of the great enigmas of the 20th century. And perhaps it is precisely this veil of uncertainty that makes many continue to wonder what secrets lie hidden beneath the sands of the Russian desert. Gibbet of Montfaucon, probably the only place on this list that, although it's also impossible to visit, you wouldn't want to anyway. We're talking about the Gibbet of Montfaucon, the monumental gallows that for centuries stood on a hill north of Paris, serving as a brutal reminder of justice and an open-air spectacle of horror. Built in the 14th century by order of King John II of France and consolidated under the reign of Charles IV, Montfaucon was not a simple improvised gallows, but a colossal stone structure designed to both impose and punish. Erected on the outskirts of the city, far from affluent neighborhoods and surrounded by institutions where the marginalized were confined, such as the convent of the Dames de Saint-Geneviève or the Saint-Lazare-le-Père colony, the site was intended to isolate the condemned and exhibit them for all to see. Its dimensions were overwhelming. A stone base several meters high supported a colonnade of 16 pillars joined by beams, forming up to 3 levels where dozens of bodies could be hung at the same time. According to chroniclers and engravings of the time, Montfaucon had the capacity to display between 40 and 50 corpses, and even more during times of war or revolts when executions multiplied. The condemned were hanged in public and left there for days, weeks, or even months, depending on the severity of their crime. In fact, in some cases, the bodies remained whole, rotting in the sun, blackened with time, and devoured by crows. However, not everyone who was there was executed on the gallows. The remains of those who had completed their mortal sentence elsewhere in the city were also hung at the site. This was intended to prolong the humiliation and send a very clear message to the population. No one was safe from this fate, as nobles accused of treason, corrupt officials, common criminals, and even figures directly linked to the court ended up exhibited on this monumental gallows. Some of the most well-known were the royal treasurer, Enguerrand de Marigny, accused of witchcraft in 1315, John Leon, Baron of Semblancay, executed in 1527, or the knight Jacques d'Angers, whose sentence after a judicial duel was ratified with his exhibition at Montfaucon in 1386. Even after the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre, the body of Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a Protestant leader murdered, was hung and exhibited as a trophy. The visual impact was devastating. Engravings and literary descriptions depict it as a sort of macabre building, a fortress without walls inhabited solely by corpses. Victor Hugo described it in The Hunchback of Notre Dame as a huge block of stone surrounded by pillars, chains, and skeletons, crowned by a perpetual flight of crows. The stench, it is said, was unbearable, and the landscape simply desolate. And as if that were not enough, at the foot of this structure, an ossuary served to dispose of the remains when there was no longer space above, reinforcing the image of Montfaucon as a machine of death and oblivion. For almost 4 centuries, this sinister monument dominated the horizon of medieval and Renaissance Paris, so it is no coincidence that many foreign travelers who passed through the city mentioned it in their chronicles, calling it one of the most impressive and terrifying places they had ever seen. Over time, the structure deteriorated, although it continued to be used until 1629. And in the mid-18th century, in a cultural climate already dominated by the ideas of the Enlightenment, The gibbet became an uncomfortable and shameful relic, so it was finally dismantled in 1760. Today, in the Faubourg de la Villette, only a discreet plaque remains to recall what happened there. However, legends persist, as some claim that when night falls, the dragging of chains, the cawing of crows, and the lamentations of the executed who once hung from its beams can still be heard. Cromwell Street, England. For more than 2 decades, number 25 Cromwell Street, in the English city of Gloucester, hid a hell behind the walls of a seemingly ordinary house. There lived Fred and Rosemary West, a couple who carried out one of the darkest and most repulsive chapters of modern British crime. Beneath the guise of a normal married couple and a family life like any other, with children, neighbors, and trivial conversations after Mass, lay a spiral of abusive violence and murders, so disturbing that even today it continues to shock those who know the story. Fred West was known for his violent temperament long before meeting Rosemary. His first wife, Catherine Lynes, often appeared with bruises and marks on her body that spoke for themselves of the abuse she suffered. In the mid-1960s, another young woman, Anne McFadden, worked as a nanny for the couple's children and began a relationship with Fred. In 1967, she disappeared without a trace while pregnant with his child. She was his first known victim. Shortly after, in 1968, Mary Blandford, a teenager who worked in a cafe, also disappeared. Her whereabouts remain unknown. And although it has never been proven, Fred is suspected of being involved. In 1969, Fred met Rosemary Letts, a 15-year-old girl with an explosive temper who quit her job at a bakery to move in with him and care for his daughters. A year later, Heather, their first daughter together, was born. In 1971, while Fred was serving a sentence for theft, his daughter Charmaine disappeared. Rosemary said she had gone with her mother, but Catherine Lynes also disappeared that same year. Subsequent investigations confirmed that both had been murdered. In 1972, Fred and Rosemary married and moved to number 25 Cromwell Street, the house that would later be known as the House of Horrors. It was there that the couple fully unleashed their sadism. The facade was that of a normal home. They had children, attended church, and greeted their neighbors courteously. Rosemary even worked as a prostitute, which was not uncommon in the area, and the couple rented rooms to vulnerable young women. What no one suspected was that many of these girls would never leave alive. The first sign of what was happening behind those walls appeared in 1972, when Fred and Rose kidnapped Caroline Owens, a nanny who briefly worked for them. They took her by force to Cromwell Street, where she was sexually assaulted, though she managed to escape. Both were only fined, a mistake that would mark the beginning of an even more brutal escalation. As on the 20th of April 1973, they murdered Linda Go, their first known joint victim, whose body was found buried under the floor of what had previously been a mechanic's workshop converted into a bathroom. In the following years, Fred and Rosemary kidnapped, tortured, and murdered numerous young women, many of them picked up while hitchhiking. Among their victims were Carol Cooper, a teenager who disappeared while returning from visiting her grandmother, Lucy Partington, a brilliant university student who never made it home for Christmas, Therese Eisler, a young Swiss woman traveling to Ireland, and Shirley Allen, a girl only 15 years old. All of them were found buried under the floor of the Cromwell Street cellar. Other victims like Juanita Mott, who disappeared the day before attending a friend's wedding, or Shirley Ann Robinson, who was pregnant with Fred at the time of her death, were found in the garden of the house. In total, 9 bodies were exhumed from the property, in addition to Robinson's unborn child. 3 more were found in other locations, such as Kempley Marsh, where Fred had imprisoned Anne McFadden and Catherine Lynes. In 1987, Heather West, Fred and Rosemary's eldest daughter, disappeared at just 16 years old. According to her siblings' accounts, they were told she had found a job and left, although they soon began to joke about the possibility of her being buried in the garden. Years later, that joke would become the key clue that revealed the truth. In 1992, an anonymous report of abuse against one of their daughters led the police to investigate the Wests. Although the case was closed after the retraction of the testimony, Heather's disappearance was registered in 1994. Suspicions grew when one of the couple's sons mentioned to a social worker the possibility that his sister might be buried in the yard. The police obtained a search warrant and began excavations on February 24 of that year. The next day, Fred West confessed to Heather's murder, indicating where he had buried the body. He also indicated the whereabouts of other victims buried outside the house, although on several occasions he changed his version of events and denied his involvement. Fred West took his own life in his cell on the 1st of January 1995, leaving a note in which he admitted to committing 11 murders. On the other hand, Rosemary was arrested and brought to trial, accused of 10 homicides. Her defense attempted to portray her as a victim manipulated by Fred, but the prosecution argued that they both acted together. In the words of prosecutor Brian Levison, in their final hours, the victims were objects of the sexual depravity of this woman and her husband. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole, becoming the second woman in modern UK history to receive such a sentence. In 1996, the authorities decided to demolish the West's house. In its place, only a pedestrian walkway remained, as if the house had never existed. But for Gloucester, the scars were deep. The city was marked by collective trauma. A feeling of guilt, anger, and sadness invaded its inhabitants, many of whom believed they should have noticed something. Local institutions also changed, improving their communication systems to prevent signs of abuse from going unnoticed as they had then. Today, more than 30 years after the discovery of the crimes, the case of Fred and Rosemary West remains a chilling reminder of how far human cruelty can go. Beneath the guise of a normal family, they created a place where suffering became routine, where death was commonplace, and where evil disguised itself as normality. A place that no longer exists on the map but remains alive in the collective memory as one of the darkest stories ever to occur in the United Kingdom. Thank you for subscribing, liking, and following us on social media. We hope you enjoyed these mysteries. Without further ado, I bid you farewell. See you later.